Okay, morning everybody. We're going to continue on with our next lesson on Bahamian wetlands. Okay, so page 85 of Bahamian landscapes. So what we're doing is we're working through the various landscapes found around the country. Okay, we've looked at our ridgelands, which were our highlands, and our rocklands, which I don't want to call them the lowlands, but it's one of the more dominant landscapes. Remember, our ridgelands and rocklands are our primary landscapes. All right, now wetlands and coastlands are secondary. Now, the reasoning for that, all right, and we'll look at it just when we get to this bit of highlighting, is because the wetlands and the coastlands are a lot more dynamic. They change a lot more, okay, whereas the ridgelands and rocklands were formed a very long period of time ago, and they've relatively stayed the same way since. All right, so let's jump in and we'll go through this as much as we can. So as much as the wetland never used and probably cannot be, it is not a landscape much visited by people. All right, so it's very difficult to penetrate. It's not the most attractive place in the world. We'll look at lots of different examples, and I'm sure you've been to some yourselves. All right, excessive vegetation and through being too wet. So obviously, look, we're looking at wetlands today. Obviously, these areas are partially submerged or underwater, or else they're underwater at different times, maybe daily, different seasons, so on. Right? Islands, however, having said that, many of the islands have very large areas, right, in this category. So New Providence, Grand Bahama, Andros in particular. New Providence has loads of wetlands, all right, from Lake Killarney to Lake Cunningham, Bonefish Pond, all this kind of stuff. Okay, so when you think about, I just put a little note here saying, consider the percentage of the area of New Providence that is wetland. We're already a tiny island, but as soon as you take off or land in the airport, as you're coming down to land, you'll notice Lake Killarney right beside you, and it looks like it takes up nearly all the island. It's a huge area of wetland that we can't really use. Okay, that's one reason why Nassau, the city, is so squished to one side, because as you go west, Cunningham and Killarney are huge big barriers. All right, now this is important. Such areas will change or evolve gradually into more solid land. So what tends to happen with wetlands is there's obviously the impact of water, and then the ones we're going to look at, all right, some more so than others. Some get more water more so than others. Some spend longer periods of time underwater. But what happens is, overall, all right, these will slowly over time become more and more solid land. In all of these areas, the water is moving very slowly. It's very still. Okay, it evaporates away, and sediments and materials get dropped and left behind. So over time, wetlands will eventually change into more and more solid land. Huge amount of time needed there. Okay, so let's burst on. Coastal wetland, just coastal is by the sea, all right. Such areas, we're going to start with tidal flats. And again, I've added a little note here, tidal, right? Changes during the day due to the tide coming in and going out. So tidal flats, pretty simple. It's flat land, that's tidal. So part of the day you might be able to walk on it, other parts of the day it'll be underwater. Very simple. All right, so in the Bahamas, these are sandy in most areas, all right, or silty or even muddy. So again, yes, you can go walking on it. I wouldn't advise it because it'll be a big sloppy mess. And then when the water comes back in, it's obviously underwater. Okay, next page. Okay, so also in our tidal flats, there's anaerobic without oxygen conditions. Okay, so the water table will also be very, very close to the surface. So because these areas are either always semi-flooded, or in the case of tidal flats, twice a day they'll be covered in water. Okay, so that means the water table is very, very high. Okay, it's just below the surface. When the tide comes in, the water table will rise up, and the water will then be above the surface. Simple. Anaerobic conditions exist, which is without oxygen. So not a huge amount of vegetation can survive. We're going to look at the veg that can. Also, unfortunately, these anaerobic conditions, they slow the decomposition of the decaying process. Okay, so it also leads to quite a bad smell. So in a lot of these wetlands, when the tide goes out, there's quite a bad smell of kind of rotting vegetation and stuff. All right, so they're not the most pleasant areas in the world. Now, wettest areas. Okay, so sorry, they're also distinguished by, there is some vegetation that lives there. All right, so the wettest areas have an algal mat, all right, which is this algae and bacteria which thrive in these anaerobic conditions. All right, so they cover large areas, and that does tend to smell, I'll be honest with you. All right. We've got these things then called bathophora. All right. Now we're going to look at some pictures of that in one of the later videos today. All right. So don't worry about that just yet. I will come back to it. It's like a club-like shape. Again, not the most attractive thing in the world, and it grows on top of the mat. Then we get into some very, very important vegetation found in these tidal flats. All right. Red and black mangroves. Now these are very important. You should be planting mangroves every chance you get. All right. Again, I'll show you some pictures of these in the PowerPoint. All right, but they grow in these tidal flats. All right. They thrive in areas that are semi-flooded. All right. They've got pneumatophores. Okay, and again, I'll show you a picture of these, but this is a good little description of them. Pneumatophores, especially, I believe the black mangroves have pneumatophores. They act like snorkels, all right, and pass oxygen to the roots. So red and black mangroves actually have their roots underwater most of the time, but they have these kind of extension branch almost, all right, that rises back up above the water and acts like a snorkel. All right, it traps. They've got these little holes or pores in the bit above the water line, and they transport oxygen back to the roots below the surface. Now, as you move towards the edge of the flats, all right, towards the kind of more solid land, you'll be joined by white mangroves and buttonwood trees. Buttonwood is another type of mangrove, all right. So as you move to the more drier areas, white mangrove and buttonwood prefer drier conditions. Red and black mangrove, wet conditions, all right. So that's our tidal flats. Large areas of flatland. Little picture at the top of page 86 here as well, kind of gives you an indication of what our tidal flats look like. Now the next one, and I'll show you some really good pictures from Grand Bahama and Andros about these tidal creeks. Creeks, not rivers. The Bahamas has no rivers, all right. So in Andros, some of the creeks are extensive and penetrate very far inland. So some very key features of tidal creeks, and again the pictures in the maybe next video will make things a bit clearer. All right, so they reach inland. Okay, creeks are connected to the ocean, so they're saline or salty. At times they may look like rivers on the map, but they are in fact marine means ocean features. All right, they rise and fall with the tide. So again, each of these bits is very important, and they are saline, they're salty. Now there is, all right, in some cases there's one called Fresh Creek. I think it's in Grand Bahama. All right, the freshwater lens actually breaks the surface, or breaks to the ground at low tide, and the surface water might actually be a little bit fresh. So again, they're tidal. When the tide comes in, these creeks are full of salt water and they reach far inland. When the tide goes out, the creeks go down and you can probably walk across the land. In some cases, like Fresh Creek, because there's so much water, the water table is actually still above the surface, so you will find some fresh water there. All right. A good example in New Providence, just Bonefish Pond. All right, we look at Bonefish Pond a bit later on. And then again, the name creek as well is also given to tidal passages between keys. All right, now this is really, if you want to write down Andros, and well, sorry, it says Andros and Grand Bahama right here. All right. Now what I've just put over here, okay, wherever you find water on land, it is usually the lowest point of land in that area. Okay, water always flows down to the lowest point. Okay, and again, our water table is usually underground unless we have heavy rainfall or the tide comes in or something. Then the water table moves above ground. Whenever you see a lake in the Bahamas, that means that is an area where the land goes so low that the water table is actually above it. That's all it is. All right. I'm going to jump onto the next page for a minute and start lagoons. Okay, just very quickly then, that was tidal creeks, very interesting. All right, and then next one is lagoons. Okay, so a lagoon, an important note to add beside here is please see coasts or coastal landforms. I should have put landforms there. Page 95, figure 7.13, and page 106. We're going to do coastlands in a couple next week, and we look back at a lot of this stuff here. So I'm going to breeze through this little passage. Okay, so don't get too concerned if I go a bit too fast. Now there are two common definitions for lagoon. Okay, the first being an area of salt water enclosed by a coral reef. And there's an image just above here of Hogsey Reef. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. Right, it's kind of just south of the Bahamas. It's in the Bahamas, but to the extreme south. and it's an underwater kind of reef in a horseshoe shape, and in between that then is called a lagoon. And lagoons are notoriously shallow water. All right, so if you look at the little diagram, you'll see there's actually only 2 bits of land, 2 k's, and then this is all the reef, which is just feet underwater, and then this is the lagoon in the middle. Okay, they can usually be very, very salty. The second and more specific area of coastal water enclosed by sandbar, sand dunes, or beach ridge. Now we will look at sandbars and dunes when we do coasts. Okay.